Hi everyone, I'm Bkhtaur and I talk about books. My whole life revolves around books actually. So if that's something that you're interested in or if that's your life too, consider subscribing. So today I thought I'd kind of talk about what my favorite classics are, my favorite classics of all time, and it's really been a difficult kind of decision deciding on which ones to talk about because I don't want to toot my own horn or anything, but I have read several because I started very early, and I think I was reading like really complex sort of classics like The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper when I was like maybe 9 years old or something. My mother was very encouraging, so there's like a large body of work to choose from, but I decided to go with the ones that may not necessarily be the most complicated, but the ones that I have read dozens of times, reread dozens of times, stuff that's really become a part of my personality. It's really kind of seeped into my soul, really. So those are the ones that I'm going to sort of mention. So I've chosen like four because otherwise this video would be really long. First up, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. So I've had like maybe 5 or 6 different copies of it in my lifetime. Some got destroyed by water damage, some were lent, some were lost, but this is the only one that remains. I've read it like maybe dozens of times, in fact, there was this whole period in my teenage in which me and my best friend Tanya, we were communicating entirely in Pride and Prejudice dialogues. So Pride and Prejudice has and continues to be sort of like a comfort novel for me. I read it every time that I'm a bit upset. I'll open a chapter and I'll read it. So it's a simple story. It's Mr. and Mrs. Bennet who have 5 daughters, and they're sort of like English middle class, if you like, or slightly above. And the mother, Mrs. Bennet, she is obsessed with getting all her daughters married off to young rich men, and that's basically like her. That's basically, the focal point of the novel. That's the focal point of her life. And out of all the daughters, she's got this one called Elizabeth, who is very, very spirited. She's a reader, and she's kind of she's got a tremendous sense of self, really. So Mrs. Bennet, obsessed with marrying off all her daughters. In fact, the novel starts with the iconic line, a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. So enter into the scene the handsome, young, amiable, lovely, pleasant Mr. Bingley and the arrogant, indifferent, really unlikable and haughty Mr. Darcy. Who's seen Colin Firth's portrayal of Mr. Darcy in the 1995 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice? If you have, comment down below. If you know what I'm talking about, the lake scene, who knows what I'm talking about? He made the best Mr. Darcy, I think, ever, really, because I've even seen the 1928 version of Pride and Prejudice. So I've seen all of them, and he is by far the best. Although I think it was Matthew McFadden who played him in 2005. He was pretty good too. Quite all right. So I've noticed over the years, people don't really understand why Pride and Prejudice is such a significant work of literature, because people think, so it's only people getting married and involved, and I think there's this famous meme, it's the whole novel is just about people visiting each other's houses. But the thing is that you have to think of it really in the context of the time, that it's a terrific social commentary, the morals and behaviors of the Victorian era, and sort of really the position of women. And then Jane Austen was sort of known for creating these kind of really strong female characters that really defied the status quo, really defied, well, not exactly the status quo, but kind of societal expectations and norms of behavior, really. And I can imagine she was herself that sort of person as well. And Elizabeth in particular, who's kind of the protagonist of Pride and Prejudice in a way. She kind of, she thinks she's at par at men. She thinks she's at par with men or better, and that kind of, creates this really wonderful kind of tension with Mr. Darcy, who's in love with her and trying to marry her, but he can't stop himself humiliating her, because obviously she's kind of much poorer than him and everything, so he continually humiliates her relatives and everything, and there's this whole tension. But then she kind of, with her tremendous sense of self-respect, she changes his opinion, and he kind of becomes this meek little lovesick dog. Oh, I love that. So definitely give it a read if you haven't. Although I think most people that watch this channel have already read it. So moving on, then we have none other than Wuthering Heights. Now, surprise, surprise, I lent my lovely Penguin edition to somebody. They never returned it, so I don't have it at the moment to show to you. This is why I no longer lend my stuff to anybody. Stuff I'll lend, not books. So Wuthering Heights was written by Emily Bronte, who belonged to the literary Bronte family of the 19th century, consisting of the sisters Anne and Charlotte. Charlotte, who wrote Jane Eyre, and the lesser-known brother Branwell Bronte, who's apparently an artist and writer of sorts, but he died very early before he could pretty much, make himself famous or anything. Because he was heavily addicted to alcohol and laudanum. Laudanum is such a Victorian thing, isn't it? Oh, a tincture of laudanum. So anyway, laudanum is like a derivative of opium, and apparently a lot of people back in that time were addicted to it. So he kind of died of, I don't know if that's related to the tuberculosis that he died from, but at any rate, he died. And Emily Bronte, who wrote Wuthering Heights, actually just died, I think, 3 months after her brother. And she, ironically, died of tuberculosis as well, although some people state that it was grief worsened by tuberculosis. So Wuthering Heights is kind of termed, categorically, it's called a Gothic romance. But intrinsically, I never felt that it was a Gothic romance. I mean, I never really categorized it that way. And it is, in fact, a difficult novel to sort of classify in that way. I think people, people that are obviously academically studying Wuthering Heights, or, kind of as a course or in literature class, they find that it's more appropriate to kind of just put it in the category because that just makes it easier to make notes or whatever. But if you're reading it on your own, which I highly suggest, even if you're not a literature student, you'll find that it defies classification. It's a wild animal. It's a wild animal with no species, with no other animal exactly like it. So it's a story of an orphan boy who is kind of taken in by the Earnshaw family, which is Mr. Earnshaw and his two children, Kathy and Hindley. And they take in this kind of, he's sort of referred to as a gypsy, but his his origins are completely kind of mysterious, and they're never really clarified in the novel. But he's termed as a gypsy by different people that come across him. And they name the boy Heathcliff, and he grows up in the same house kind of as a foster child / adopted son of Mr. Earnshaw. And obviously he and Kathy grow up together, and they have this incredible connection, and they love each other very much. But then there's this turn of events. Mr. Earnshaw kind of drops dead, and Hindley, who's his son, who's always hated Heathcliff because Heathcliff was very much loved by his father, he kind of degrades Heathcliff, makes him a servant. It's kind of like this topsy-turvy Cinderella story too, in a way. He kind of makes Heathcliff, who was previously the star of the household, sort of a lowly servant, and he starts living in the stables. But obviously he and Kathy very much still love each other. They grow up together. They're 18 or 20, when Kathy, sort of sick of her, menial circumstances and the fact that Heathcliff has been brought so low by her brother, she kind of, she marries the wealthy Edgar Linton, who is obviously, she sort of likes him, but it's nothing compared to the love that she has for Heathcliff. And and she says to her housekeeper that, my love for Edgar is kind of like, the leaves in the forest. The weather, the years will change them, but my love for Heathcliff is like the eternal rocks beneath. Nothing can change it. Anyway, so around this time, Heathcliff runs off, obviously heartbroken and everything, and he understands that it's because of his social class that he's been, sort of dejected, kind of, by Kathy. But obviously he loves her madly. So he returns years later, when she's obviously already married, and he returns years later rich. So it's very like a Gatsby-esque situation, although obviously The Great Gatsby came out in the 21st century. So you might say that Gatsby could have, F. Scott Fitzgerald could have taken some, inspiration from Wuthering Heights rather than the other way around. So anyway, he returns rich, and again, you're not sure how he's come into all of that money, given that he has no family and that he was an orphan to begin with. But anyway, he comes in, and it's this whole thing. So, Wuthering Heights is a tough nut to crack, because when it came out in 1847, it was not popular. People did not understand it. Literary critics of the time called it violent and tough to read, harsh, appalling at times, kind of frightening, because again, you have to understand, most of the novels that were being published at that time, they were kind of really mild and romantic, and it was apparently, if I'm not wrong, the Romantic era of literature at that time that was ongoing. So all the novels were very, this really nice courtship going on and nothing. But in Wuthering Heights, you have violence and physical cruelty, left, right, and center. People are getting struck, people are getting injured, people are dying. Heathcliff, there's this scene in which Heathcliff has Kathy's grave dug up, and he kind of climbs into it There's this extreme obsession, physical violence, and the language is very difficult to read as well. And then at the backdrop of all of it, you have the notorious Moors, the Moors of Wuthering Heights. Wuthering Heights is basically the name of the Earnshaw home. So it's surrounded by these rocky, barren moors in which the wind is very, very harsh and always blowing. And so that's basically the setting. So people were kind of like, the readers were kind of taken aback, like, what is this? What is happening here exactly? So it didn't really fit into the time the society was at. It was very much ahead of its time. So people, I believe, were not really at that level. They were too foolish to understand what was happening. So it was not popular right away. And I think, obviously, Emily Bronte died within a year of its publication, as I mentioned before, in case I mentioned this before. So she never really got to see that it would become this, this remarkable, supreme classic of English literature in the decades that followed. So she never really got to see its success because she was already dead. And funny thing about the Moors, Emily Bronte, she spent a lot of time in the Yorkshire Moors. So the Moors in Wuthering Heights are kind of modeled after them, if you like. So the language, people that read it nowadays, in my conversations with them, I realize that they don't take to the language. They don't take to the kind of slow pace of the novel. But I loved it. I loved it right away, and I've read it several times since. I'm just obsessed with all the dialogues. More on that later. The sort of formatting of the novel, the conceptualization is a work of extraordinary imagination, It's done very methodically. There's the second part of Heathcliff's life in which he adopts Hindley's son Hareton, and then Cathy is dead, but, her daughter, who's also named Catherine, comes. It's like the way the novel is kind of laid out is... I find that it would be near impossible to recreate any of that kind of scope in any novel published today or written today. I think writers nowadays don't have the brain for it. They don't have the capacity to create something like that. I think that's just, like I said, Wuthering Heights is like a rare species. It's like a rare animal. You can't replicate it. You can't replicate its magnificence in any way. People nowadays definitely can't. And in fact, they don't even have the intelligence to fully understand what the novel means. Heathcliff, in my opinion, is one of the most interesting characters in English literature, right? He's got this really chameleon-like quality, he can... Because whenever you consider the different roles that he takes in the novel, lover, husband, foster father, landlord, it's like he's got this really mysterious... No matter how many times I've read Wuthering Heights, you can't pin Heathcliff down. He's completely wild. That's why he's often referred to as a gypsy. He's something different in every situation, and the only thing that is constant in his life is his death-defying obsession and love for Cathy. That's the only thing that is central to his personality. That's the only thing that withstands the test of time and is the same in every situation that he's in. But other than that, you can't pin him down. You can't understand who he is, You can't predict what he's going to do. Is he cruel? Is he just a man in love? Is he wild? Is he civilized? Because there's a period of life in which he's wearing suits and ties and he's very civilized and people are obsessed with him. So again, he's a complete enigma. There's this line that I love. If all else perished and he remained, I would still continue to be. But if he were annihilated, the world would be to me a mighty stranger. It's giving me chills. I don't know if you can tell. He says to her, she's like, I was afraid you'd forgotten me. And he was like, I could sooner forget you than my own existence. So yeah, if you're faint of heart, don't read Wuthering Heights. But yeah, it's definitely one of the best books that I've ever read. It's had a tremendous effect on me, and I never recovered from it. Yeah, it's like a blow to the heart, really. So next up, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte's sister, Charlotte Bronte. And Jane Eyre was liked right away. Jane Eyre was popular right away, right after it was published. And I imagine it's because the common people could understand and relate to the themes a bit more easily, and it wasn't this wild, unfathomable novel like Wuthering Heights. So the fact that it was slightly more ordinary than Wuthering Heights made for its immediate success. And but in fact, Wuthering Heights is considered to be intellectually and from a literary perspective far superior. It's not just my opinion. In fact, every literary critic worth his salt in the past century has stated that Wuthering Heights is a far superior work of literature. However, Jane Eyre is exceptional in its own right, and it is one of my favorites. You have Jane, an orphan who is brought up by her abusive aunt and cousins who are continuously beating her up and depriving her of affection and food. And then she is shipped off to the lowly Lowood School, which in fact is actually, Charlotte Bronte herself was kind of studied from a school similar. So the Lowood School is actually based off of her own childhood in some respect. So Jane in the novel is shipped off to the Lowood School where she is further abused. Then she reaches 18 years of age where she kind of applies for a job and is accepted as a governess for one mysterious, handsome so-called bachelor, Mr. Rochester, who lives in a mansion, in a mysterious mansion. And she accepts a position as a governess for his young ward, who it's not stated in quite so many words in the novel, but the ward is kind of like his illegitimate daughter from a French opera singer. So, allegedly, there's no, it's never stated as clearly as that, because obviously you have to bear in mind this is a Victorian novel. They're not going to talk about such things, in that way. So yeah, she and Mr. Rochester fall in love, even though Mr. Rochester is much older than her, but they have this connection. They fall in love and they decide to get married, but on the day of the wedding, unfortunately, they are interrupted by Mr. Rochester's brother-in-law, which apparently Mr. Rochester is married to an insane woman who he should have thrown in an asylum, but he kind of took pity on her and he keeps her in a spare room in his mansion hidden away, and he's hired this woman to look after her. And his wife is completely insane, like 100% mad. So, but obviously, so technically he had been living the sort of bachelor lifestyle, but he never told Jane that he was already married. And it's the 19th century, so technically you can't practice polygamy. So he can't actually marry Jane, even if he wants to. He can't marry anyone until his wife is dead, which of course she is in the prime of youth, mad as she is, so she's not going anywhere. So, yeah. And just a small side note, another writer, Jean Rice, I believe her name was, wrote White Sargasso Sea, which was considered kind of like a prequel to Jane Eyre. Obviously, Jean Rice was an entirely different novelist and everything, of course. But she wrote White Sargasso Sea sort of to elaborate on the relationship between Antonetta Bertha Mason, who is the wife of the insane wife of Mr. Rochester, and Mr. Rochester, so sort of taking you back to a time when they first got married and she was not mad, and how he may have been the reason she got mad, or developed the madness that I think was already prevalent from her mother's side. So it's kind of like the story of their marriage, and I think she was sort of part Jamaican or something, and she'd come into a large fortune. So it's sort of about the society and politics of that time as well. There's a very interesting read. I read it years ago. So if you can get your hands on it and you're a big fan of Jane Eyre, definitely read White Sargasso Sea, I would say. So, I always love Jane Eyre because Jane in herself is, she's a very unusual girl for her time, She's an orphan, she's poor, she has no fortune, but she's got this tremendous sense of self and self-respect and pride, and she carries herself with this kind of grace, which, you really can't explain, this almost, this inwardly regal nature of hers, even though she's outwardly plain. All her, her clothes are not necessarily of the best quality. She doesn't have much money. She's working as a governess, but, you can't sway her. Charlotte Bronte wanted to create a character that you couldn't a character that could not be swayed, influenced, or controlled by any man in her life. And that's exactly what Jane Eyre is. Even, and Mr. Rochester calls her this rare, unearthly thing. He says that, I feel like there's a string, connected to my heart, connecting both our hearts, and if you were gone, that string, that cord of communion would break, and I would bleed inwardly and die, but you would be fine because you're strong. You're like a bird. You would fly away. You would be fine, but I would take to bleeding inwardly, and obviously his life really does go downhill from after she runs away. So lastly, we have The Island of Doctor Moreau, which I actually The Island of Doctor Moreau by H.G.Wells, which I actually read last year, in fact. So, it's not been a lifelong obsession, but it was so impressive that I have to put it in this list, really. So I read it last year and I made a whole video about it, so I'm not going to go into too much detail right now. But it's basically a sci-fi horror novel by acclaimed sci-fi author H.G.Wells, who also wrote The War of the Worlds and The Invisible Man and The Time Machine and a bunch of other novels. And it's about this one Dr. Moreau who lives on his own little island of horrors where he practices an inhumane and really unethical kind of branch of surgery that he calls vivisection, in which he kind of converts wild animals into half animal, half human beings by torturing them essentially. And he's let loose all of these creatures on the island. It's apparently his own island because he can't function in civilized society. And he's let them loose and he kind of controls them as well. And he's this sick madman, sick mad scientist. Well, not technically a scientist, just like a mad doctor, which of course in the Victorian era was becoming like pretty much a very popular theme because you have Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and all of these other novels. So it was something that was kind of a well-known kind of theme at the time. So yeah, he creates these messed up kind of creatures that apparently are a ticking time bomb, and they kind of, because they're half animal and half human, they kind of revert back to their animal instincts after a while. It's this whole thing. It's very, very interesting. Because I've done a whole video on it, I don't want to rant on about it now. I'm definitely going to link the video in the description. Make sure that you check it out, and make sure that you read this. It's not very long, and I know you'll love it if you love classics, or even if you don't actually, you'll love it. That's all for today, folks. Let me know if you've read any of these. I'm sure you already have. Many of the people that watch and support my channel are, much more well-read than I am, let's just say. So they're just amazing people. So, I'm sure that you read all of these. Share your experiences and opinions with me. I'd love to discuss it with all of you. I hope that you're all staying safe and taking care of yourself. Take care. And, yeah, I'll see you next time.